The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport cast harsh shadows across Terminal B as Commander Marcus Williams made his way toward Gate 36. His crisp Navy suit contrasted with the casual attire of most travelers, but Marcus wasn't most travelers. 26 years in the Air Force had instilled in him a sense of presentation that never quite faded, even 5 years into retirement. His silver-rimmed glasses sat perfectly centered on his face, and his close-cropped hair, now peppered with gray, was neatly trimmed, the only concession to his military past. Marcus checked his watch, a habit that had survived countless missions and deployments, and noted he had 45 minutes before boarding would begin for his flight to Washington, D.C. Just enough time to grab coffee and review his notes for tomorrow's Veterans Advocacy meeting with several key senators. This wasn't his first time testifying before Congress about improving health care for veterans, but each appearance mattered, especially now that funding was on the chopping block again. As he approached the coffee shop, his phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Aaliyah. "Knock 'em dead tomorrow, Dad. Mom and I are proud of you." A smile crossed his face as he typed back a quick thanks. After missing so many of Aaliyah's milestones during his deployments, their relationship had finally found solid ground. Her support meant everything. Waiting in line, Marcus couldn't help overhearing the conversation between two flight attendants ahead of him. "Another full flight to D.C. I swear if I have to deal with one more entitled passenger trying to bring oversized luggage." The taller woman rolled her eyes dramatically. Her colleague nodded sympathetically. "Tell me about it. At least the first-class cabin is usually manageable. Business types keep to themselves." Marcus smiled politely when they glanced his way, but their expressions remained neutral, almost dismissive. It was a look he recognized well, the quick assessment, the subtle shift away, the silent message that his presence had been noted but not welcomed. After decades of service, of commanding rooms full of military brass, of negotiating with foreign officials in tense situations, it was these small, everyday moments that still had the power to sting. Coffee in hand, Marcus found a quiet corner near his gate and opened his briefcase. Inside were carefully organized statistics on veteran suicide rates, homelessness, and the chronic underfunding of VA hospitals, realities that politicians acknowledged with solemn nods, but rarely addressed with meaningful action. Tomorrow's testimony wasn't just another meeting, it was personal. He'd lost too many friends not to combat, but to the system that failed them after they'd returned home. The minutes ticked by, and eventually, the gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're now beginning our pre-boarding process for Flight 1372 to Washington, D.C. We invite our active military members and veterans with disabilities to board at this time." Marcus gathered his things and approached the gate, boarding pass and ID in hand. The same flight attendants he'd seen at the coffee shop were now checking passengers' credentials, their professional smiles firmly in place. "Good afternoon," Marcus said, handing over his documents. The taller attendant, whose name tag read Brenda, glanced at his boarding pass, then at him, her smile dimming slightly. "Sir, we're currently boarding active duty military. General boarding will begin shortly." "I understand," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm a retired Air Force commander. Veterans are included in the pre-boarding announcement." Brenda's expression tightened. "Do you have military ID?" Marcus produced his retired military ID alongside his driver's license. "Right here, right." She examined it with what seemed like excessive scrutiny before passing it to her colleague, whose name tag read Karen. They exchanged a look that Marcus had seen countless times before, a silent communication that carried volumes of unspoken assumptions. "Sir, this states you're retired," Karen said, emphasizing the word as if it negated his entire service record. "The pre-boarding is for active military." "And veterans," Marcus added, keeping his voice even, as was just announced. By now, several other passengers had gathered behind him, their impatience palpable. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, the silent judgment. the collective desire for him to step aside and stop causing a delay. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to wait for your assigned boarding group," Brenda said, her tone now carrying an edge of authority. "We have procedures to follow." Marcus took a deep breath, weighing his options. He could push back, point out the clear discrimination taking place, but decades of experience had taught him when battles were worth fighting and when they merely reinforced others' preconceptions. With a slight nod, he stepped aside. "Of course, I wouldn't want to disrupt your procedures." He watched as 3 white men in civilian clothes approached next, one wearing a camouflage baseball cap with "Veteran" emblazoned across the front. Without hesitation, both Brenda and Karen waved them through with smiles and quick "thank you for your service" comments. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, but he maintained his composure. This wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. When his actual boarding group was called, he passed through the gate without making eye contact with either attendant. Settling into his first-class seat, a necessity for his still troublesome back injury from a helicopter incident in his last deployment, Marcus placed his briefcase under the seat in front of him and closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the familiar weight of frustration before compartmentalizing it away, another skill honed by years of command. The cabin slowly filled with other passengers, the usual symphony of overhead bins, slamming and muffled conversations forming the backdrop to Marcus's mental preparation for tomorrow's testimony. He was so focused on his thoughts that he almost missed the flight attendant hovering by his side. "Excuse me, sir," Brenda said, her voice artificially pleasant but her eyes cold. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Marcus handed it over without comment. "There seems to be some confusion," she continued, studying the boarding pass with exaggerated care. "This seat is reserved for our premium customers." "I'm aware," Marcus replied. "I purchased a first-class ticket." Brenda's smile remained fixed in place, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Nevertheless, I need to verify this reservation. There may have been a system error." By now, other passengers were boarding, some slowing as they passed by, curious about the unfolding scene. Marcus maintained his calm exterior, even as he recognized the familiar pattern, the questioning of his legitimacy, the implication that he didn't belong. "I assure you there's no error," he said. "I've been flying this route monthly for the past 3 years, always in first class due to a service-related injury." "I'll need to check with the captain," Brenda replied, turning away without waiting for his response. Marcus sat perfectly still, his face betraying nothing of the calculations running through his mind. 26 years of service, countless medals including a Purple Heart, and still, in 2025, this was his reality. The realization sat heavy in his chest, not because it was surprising, but because it was so predictably exhausting. Minutes later, Brenda returned with Karen and a man in a pilot's uniform whose name tag identified him as First Officer Richardson. "Sir," Richardson began, his tone already condescending, "I understand there's some confusion about your seating assignment." "There's no confusion on my part," Marcus replied, his voice level but firm. "I purchased a first-class ticket. I have a confirmed seat assignment. I'm sitting in that assigned seat." Richardson glanced at Brenda, who gave a slight headshake. "Sir, we've had several complaints about a disruption during boarding and now this situation. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." "What complaints?" Marcus asked, genuinely surprised. "I stepped aside when asked during pre-boarding, despite being eligible. I've been sitting quietly in my assigned seat since boarding. What exactly is the disruption?" The 3 crew members exchanged glances, and it was Karen who spoke next, her voice lowered as if sharing a confidence. "Sir, if you continue to create a disturbance, we'll have no choice but to ask you to deplane." The absurdity of the situation might have been comical if it weren't so familiar. Marcus looked around at the now nearly full first-class cabin, noting that he was the only black passenger in this section. Several nearby passengers were openly watching the exchange, some with discomfort, others with that particular expression of people witnessing something they know isn't right, but finding it easier to look away. "I see," Marcus said quietly. He reached for his phone. "In that case, I'd like to document this interaction for my own records. Recording airline personnel is against company policy," Brenda said quickly, her hand moving as if to block his phone. "I'm not recording, I'm taking notes," Marcus clarified, though he had every intention of documenting this encounter one way or another. Unless that's also against policy? The tension was palpable now, the pretense of customer service professionalism wearing thin on both sides. First Officer Richardson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist that you deplane immediately. We can discuss this matter further with customer service representatives in the terminal." Marcus looked directly at Richardson, his gaze unwavering. "On what grounds?" "Non-compliance with crew member instructions," Karen interjected, her voice carrying just enough to ensure nearby passengers could hear. "It's a federal offense, sir." The implied threat hung in the air. Marcus knew his rights, knew the hollow nature of the accusation, but also understood the reality of his situation. As a black man, regardless of his rank or accomplishments, escalation carried risks that others might not face. With deliberate calm, Marcus gathered his briefcase and stood. "I'll deplane," he said, his voice measured. "But I want your names and employee numbers documented, and I want the captain to personally explain which instruction I failed to comply with." The first-class cabin had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. Marcus stood in the aisle, briefcase in hand, aware that every eye was on him. He'd faced down insurgents and negotiated with warlords, but this particular brand of humiliation, public, pointed and wrapped in the veneer of protocol, cut in its own unique way. "I'll need the captain," Marcus repeated calmly, "not the first officer. If I'm being deplaned for non-compliance, I want to hear directly from the commander of this aircraft which instructions I failed to follow." First Officer Richardson shifted uncomfortably. "The captain is completing pre-flight checks. I have full authority to—" "You have authority," Marcus interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to being heard. "But not the final word. I've commanded aircraft and crews in combat zones. I understand chain of command intimately. I'm requesting to speak with your superior officer before I deplane." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Richardson's face. The script was deviating, and none of the crew seemed prepared for Marcus's composed insistence. From 2 rows behind, a woman's voice broke the tension. "This is ridiculous. He hasn't done anything wrong." Marcus didn't turn to look, keeping his attention focused on the crew members in front of him. Brenda's face had flushed slightly, whether from anger or embarrassment was unclear. "I'll get the captain," Richardson finally said, turning toward the cockpit. Karen stepped closer to Marcus, lowering her voice. "Sir, you're delaying departure. If we miss our takeoff slot because of this, that will be added to the report." The implied threat didn't faze him. "I understand the importance of departure times, believe me. I've overseen operations where minutes meant lives, but I also understand the importance of accountability." Before Karen could respond, a tall, older white man in a captain's uniform appeared from the cockpit, his expression a careful, professional neutral. Captain Davidson, according to his name tag, assessed the situation with a quick glance before addressing Marcus directly. "Commander Williams?" he asked, surprising Marcus with the correct use of his rank. "I understand there's an issue we need to resolve." "Yes, Captain," Marcus replied. "Your crew has asked me to deplane for non-compliance, but no one has specified which instruction I've failed to comply with. I'd like clarification before I exit." The captain's eyes flickered briefly toward Brenda and Karen. "I see. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "With all due respect, sir, the accusation was made publicly. Multiple passengers witnessed your crew's behavior. I think transparency is appropriate now." A murmur of agreement came from several nearby passengers. Captain Davidson seemed to take the measure of the situation, nodding slowly. "Fair enough. Brenda, Karen, what specific instruction did Commander Williams fail to follow?" The two flight attendants exchanged glances before Brenda spoke. He was argumentative during boarding, refused to wait for his proper boarding group, and questioned our seating verification procedure. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though internally he marveled at the creative reframing of events. Captain Davidson turned to him. "Commander?" "I presented my veteran ID during pre-boarding when it was announced that military and veterans could board. I was told to wait for my assigned group, which I did without argument. I've been sitting quietly in my assigned first-class seat since boarding. When asked for my boarding pass again, I provided it without comment. The only thing I've refused is to accept being removed from my legitimate seat without explanation." The captain's gaze shifted around the cabin, taking in the expressions of nearby passengers. Several nodded in confirmation of Marcus's account. "He's telling the truth," came the same woman's voice from before. "I watched the whole thing. They singled him out. 3 white guys with military hats walked right on during pre-boarding," added another passenger. "No questions asked." Captain Davidson's expression remained carefully professional, but a slight tightening around his eyes suggested he was recalculating his approach. He turned back to his crew. "Brenda, Karen, I need to see both of you in the galley for a moment." His tone was pleasant but left no room for argument. As the 3 crew members stepped away, Marcus remained standing, acutely aware of the delay he was causing, but unwilling to back down now. He'd spent too many years watching others in his position choose the path of least resistance, swallowing their dignity to avoid making waves. Not today. A middle-aged white woman sitting across the aisle leaned toward him. "I'm recording this," she whispered, angling her phone slightly to show him the screen. "Just in case you need it later." Marcus nodded his thanks, touched by the small act of allyship but still wary. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Aaliyah wondering if he'd boarded yet. He'd have to update her later. Right now he needed to stay focused. After a brief but intense-looking conversation in the galley, Captain Davidson returned alone. His expression now shifted to one of professional courtesy. "Commander Williams, I apologize for the confusion. You're welcome to retake your seat. We'll be departing shortly." It was a deft sidestep, acknowledging no wrongdoing while attempting to defuse the situation. Marcus recognized the strategy but wasn't quite ready to let it go. "Captain, I appreciate that. But I'd like to understand what just happened here. Was there actually a complaint from other passengers?" Davidson hesitated, weighing his words. "There appears to have been a miscommunication among my crew. I've addressed it, and we're ready to move forward." "Miscommunication," Marcus repeated quietly, the euphemism hanging in the air between them. "I see. A decision point." Marcus could retake his seat, swallow the indignity, and focus on tomorrow's testimony. Or he could stand his ground and demand the accountability that veterans like himself had earned, not just for the respect of their service, but for the basic dignity every passenger deserved. The choice crystallized when he saw Brenda at the galley entrance, her expression a mixture of resentment and embarrassment, not remorse, not recognition, just the inconvenience of being caught. "Captain Davidson," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar moments across his lifetime, "I've decided I won't be flying with your airline today after all." A ripple of surprise went through the cabin. The captain's carefully constructed resolution was falling apart. "Commander, that's not necessary. We can ensure you have a comfortable flight, and it's not about comfort. Marcus interrupted gently. It's about integrity. I'm speaking to Congress tomorrow about how our systems fail to respect veterans. It would be hypocritical of me to passively accept this treatment now. Davidson seemed genuinely concerned now, perhaps finally recognizing the potential repercussions. Please, Commander Williams, I assure you this isn't reflective of our airline's values. Values are demonstrated in actions, Captain, not assurances, Marcus replied, gathering his carry-on from the overhead bin. I'll be happy to discuss this further with your company's leadership, but I won't be on this flight. As Marcus moved toward the exit, something unexpected happened. The woman who had spoken up earlier stood as he passed. I'm not flying with this airline either, she announced, pulling her bag from under the seat. This was inexcusable. Then another passenger stood, and another. Within moments, 6 people, a mix of races, ages, and genders, had gathered their belongings and were preparing to deplane alongside Marcus. This is getting out of hand, Karen said anxiously to the captain. We're going to miss our departure slot. Marcus paused at the front of the cabin. That was never my intention. I don't want anyone else to disrupt their travel plans on my account. It's not on your account, said a younger man joining the group. It's on principle. My grandfather was a Tuskegee airman. I know what you're feeling right now. The spontaneous solidarity was so unexpected that Marcus felt a tightness in his throat. He nodded his thanks, unable to find the right words in the moment. Captain Davidson, now facing the prospect of multiple passengers deplaning and the inevitable incident reports that would follow, made one last attempt. Commander Williams, would you reconsider if I personally guaranteed that the crew members involved would not serve in the first-class cabin during this flight? It was a peace offering, but an insufficient one. Marcus shook his head. This isn't about who serves me my coffee, Captain. It's about a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed systemically, not just managed for one flight. With that, Marcus turned and walked off the plane, followed by his impromptu coalition of supporters. As they moved through the jet bridge, the reality of his decision began to sink in. He'd have to find another flight to D.C., potentially missing crucial preparation time for tomorrow's testimony. But some principles couldn't be compromised, even for pragmatic reasons. In the terminal, the group dispersed with handshakes and supportive comments. The woman who had first spoken up introduced herself as Dr. Elaine Winters, a psychology professor, heading to a conference. That took courage, she said, offering her business card. Let me know if you need a witness statement for whatever comes next. Marcus thanked her, tucking the card into his jacket pocket. As the others drifted toward customer service to rebook their flights, Marcus pulled out his phone, which now showed 3 missed calls from Aaliyah. Before he could call her back, another call came in, from a number he didn't recognize. Commander Williams speaking, he answered. Commander, this is Sandra Mitchell, Vice President of Customer Experience at Zenith Airlines. The voice was crisp, professional, with an undertone of urgency. I understand there was an incident on our Flight 1372. I'd like to personally address this situation immediately. Are you still in the terminal? Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by the speed of the response. I am. Would you be willing to meet me in the Zenith Club Lounge? I'm heading there now from my office. I can do that, Marcus replied, curiosity overriding his initial instinct to decline. How had this escalated to VP level so quickly? Thank you. I'll meet you there in 5 minutes. As Marcus headed toward the lounge, he called Aaliyah back, explaining the situation in brief terms that wouldn't worry her unnecessarily. You did the right thing, Dad, she said firmly. But what about your meeting tomorrow? I'll figure it out, he assured her. There are other flights. Keep me posted, and Dad, I'm proud of you. The simple statement warmed him as he ended the call and approached the lounge entrance. Whatever came next, he knew he had stayed true to himself and the values he'd spent a lifetime defending, sometimes on battlefields and sometimes in places like this, where the conflicts were quieter but no less significant. The Zenith Airlines Club lounge stood in stark contrast to the bustling terminal outside, an oasis of muted lighting, comfortable seating, and the gentle murmur of quiet conversations. Marcus presented his credentials to the attendant, who nodded immediately. "Commander Williams, we've been expecting you. Please follow me." She led him past the main seating area toward a private conference room at the back of the lounge. Marcus noted the curious glances from other travelers as he passed. News traveled fast in airports, and he wondered how much of what had happened on the plane was already circulating through the terminal. The conference room door opened to reveal a sleek table with 4 people already seated. At the head sat a woman in her late 50s, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a professional bun, wearing a charcoal suit with the Zenith Airlines executive pin prominently displayed. "Commander Williams," she said, rising to greet him with an extended hand. "I'm Sandra Mitchell, VP of Customer Experience. Thank you for meeting with us." Marcus shook her hand, taking note of the firm grip and direct eye contact. She gestured to the others at the table. "This is Terrence Jackson, our Chief Diversity Officer, James Harrington, Legal Counsel, and Rachel Kim, Director of Flight Operations." Marcus acknowledged each with a nod, intrigued by the high-powered assemblage. This wasn't a routine customer service response. This was crisis management. "Please have a seat," Sandra continued, indicating the chair across from her. "Can we offer you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Water would be fine," Marcus replied, settling into the chair and placing his briefcase beside him. Rachel immediately poured him a glass from the carafe on the table. Sandra folded her hands on the table, her expression a careful balance of professional concern and genuine regret. "Commander, I want to begin by offering my sincere apologies for your experience on our flight today. What happened was unacceptable and completely counter to Zenith's values and policies." Marcus took a sip of water, giving himself a moment to assess the situation. The rapid response, the executive presence, the carefully chosen words, all suggested they understood the gravity of what had occurred, or at least the potential public relations disaster it represented. "I appreciate your prompt attention to this matter," he replied neutrally, "though I'm curious how it reached your level so quickly." Sandra exchanged glances with Terrence before responding. "Social media moves faster than our planes, Commander. One of your fellow passengers posted a video of the incident before you even deplaned. It's already gained significant traction online." That explained the urgency. Marcus hadn't realized anyone besides the woman across the aisle had been recording. Terrence, a distinguished black man in his early 60s, leaned forward. "Commander Williams, your military service record is exemplary. 26 years retiring as a full commander, Purple Heart recipient, multiple overseas deployments. You've literally written the book on leadership under pressure." He paused. "And today our staff treated you like a security threat rather than the honored guest and American hero you are." The explicit acknowledgement was unexpected. Marcus had braced himself for corporate doublespeak and carefully worded non-apologies. This directness suggested either genuine remorse or exceptional damage control. "Mr. Jackson," Marcus responded, "while I appreciate the recognition of my service, this isn't about my military record. I've witnessed countless other black passengers, with and without military backgrounds, subjected to similar treatment. The issue isn't that they disrespected a veteran, it's that this kind of profiling happens every day to people who don't have the privilege of titles that might protect them." Jackson nodded, a flicker of what looked like genuine understanding crossing his face. "You're absolutely right. And that makes what happened even more inexcusable." James Harrington, the lawyer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus had encountered enough corporate attorneys to recognize the tension between legal risk management and genuine accountability. Harrington clearly wanted to control the conversation, but Sandra seemed intent on maintaining a different tone. "Commander," Sandra continued, "we're not here to offer excuses or try to minimize what happened. The behavior of our crew members was discriminatory, plain and simple. What I would like to do is listen, truly listen, to your account of what transpired, and then discuss how we can properly address this situation." Marcus studied her for a moment, searching for signs of insincerity but finding none. With measured precision, he recounted the events from beginning to end: the pre-boarding discrimination, the questioning of his first-class status, the escalation to threats of federal charges, and finally, the captain's inadequate attempt at resolution. When he finished, the room was silent. Rachel Kim, who had been taking notes throughout, looked visibly disturbed. Terrence's expression had hardened, and even the lawyer seemed unable to find words to soften the reality of what had happened. Sandra broke the silence. "First, I want to assure you that all 3 crew members involved have been removed from service pending a full investigation. That's already happened." "That's a start," Marcus acknowledged, "but removals and investigations that happen behind closed doors rarely lead to systemic change." "Which brings me to why we wanted to meet with you," Sandra replied. "We're not just hoping to make this right for you, Commander Williams. We want your input on how we address the underlying issues." Marcus raised an eyebrow, surprised by the openness. "Most companies in your position would be focused on damage control and a quick settlement." James Harrington finally spoke up. "We've prepared compensation options, of course, a full refund, complimentary first-class tickets, premium status upgrade." "James," Sandra interrupted gently but firmly, "let's put aside the standard playbook for a moment." She turned back to Marcus. "Commander, you're scheduled to testify before Congress tomorrow about veteran support systems. You understand institutional change. We've been working on diversity initiatives for years, but clearly they're not effectively reaching all levels of our organization. I'm proposing something different." Marcus leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite his skepticism. "I'm listening." "We'd like to offer you a consulting role. Help us identify where our training is failing, where our policies have gaps, and how we can create meaningful accountability. We don't want to just make this incident go away. We want to prevent the next one." The proposal caught Marcus off guard. He'd expected the usual corporate routine: apologies followed by hushed settlements designed to buy silence. This approach suggested either remarkable sincerity or sophisticated PR strategy, possibly both. "That's an interesting proposal," he replied carefully, "but real change requires transparency and public accountability. How open are you to that aspect?" Terrence Jackson nodded. "That's exactly why we'd value your involvement, Commander. Confidential settlements and internal reviews haven't moved the needle far enough. We're prepared to be more transparent about both our failures and our corrective actions." James Harrington looked like he was about to object, but Sandra's subtle headshake stopped him. Marcus noted the exchange with interest. "Before I consider any proposal," Marcus said, "there's the immediate matter of my testimony tomorrow. I need to be in Washington, D.C. by morning." "Already addressed," Rachel Kim spoke up for the first time. "We have a corporate jet departing for D.C. in 90 minutes. It was scheduled to return empty after dropping off our CEO for meetings. It's yours if you want it." Marcus couldn't help but be impressed by the efficiency, though he wasn't about to be swayed by perks. "That's generous, but—" "It's not a bribe, Commander," Sandra interjected, seeming to read his thoughts. "It's the bare minimum of ensuring your important work isn't disrupted by our failure. Whether you accept our proposal or decide to pursue other actions against Zenith, that flight is yours." The sincerity in her voice gave him pause. Marcus had walked into this meeting expecting corporate theater, But the conversation had taken an unexpected turn toward substance. "What about the other passengers who deplaned with me?" he asked. "Their plans were disrupted as well." "All 6 have been rebooked on later flights with upgrades," Rachel confirmed. "We've also provided meal vouchers and lounge access while they wait." Marcus nodded approvingly. "And the crew members?" Sandra and Terrence exchanged glances before she answered. "As I mentioned, they've been removed from service pending investigation. But I suspect you're asking about the longer-term consequences." "I am. Our standard procedure would involve sensitivity training and possible disciplinary action," Terrence explained. "But I think we all recognize that standard procedure isn't adequate here." "It rarely is," Marcus agreed. "Sensitivity training creates the illusion of action without addressing power dynamics or systemic issues." "Exactly," Sandra said, "which is why we're proposing a more comprehensive approach. Not just discipline for these individuals, but a structural review of how we hire, train, evaluate, and promote our staff." Marcus leaned back slightly, considering. The proposal was compelling, certainly more substantive than he'd expected. But years of watching institutions promise change only to return to business as usual had made him cautious. "I appreciate your offer," he said finally. "But I'd need to see concrete commitments before considering a consulting role. Specifically, I'd want public acknowledgement of what occurred, transparent reporting on the outcomes of your investigation, and a clear roadmap for systemic changes with measurable benchmarks." Instead of resistance, he saw nods around the table, even from Harrington the lawyer, though his was more reluctant. "Those are reasonable requests," Sandra agreed. "We can prepare a formal proposal with those elements for your review." Marcus glanced at his watch. If the corporate jet was leaving in 90 minutes, he still had time to consider his options and make arrangements for his arrival in D.C. "There's one more thing," he added. "I mentioned that another passenger recorded the incident. I'd like to understand how Zenith is planning to respond publicly, given that this is already circulating on social media." At this, James Harrington finally found his voice. "Our communications team is preparing a statement expressing regret for the incident and affirming our commitment to treating all passengers with respect." Marcus shook his head. "Generic statements won't cut it, not for this moment." "What would you suggest?" Sandra asked, and Marcus noted there seemed to be genuine interest in his response. "Acknowledge specifically what happened. Racial profiling of a black passenger. Don't hide behind vague language about the incident or misunderstandings. Take clear responsibility, outline specific actions being taken, and invite public accountability for the results." Terrence was nodding emphatically. "I've been advocating for exactly this kind of directness in our communications." James looked distinctly uncomfortable. "There are legal considerations. There are moral ones too," Marcus interrupted. "And practical ones. The truth is already out there on video. Dancing around it only makes Zenith look insincere and calculating." Sandra studied him thoughtfully. "You're right. And that's exactly the kind of perspective we need." She turned to James. "Revise the statement along these lines. Commander Williams has given us a clear path forward." The lawyer reluctantly made notes on his tablet, while Sandra returned her attention to Marcus. "Commander, while you consider our consulting proposal, would you be willing to review our public statement before it's released? Your input would be invaluable." Marcus sat alone in a smaller private room within the Zenith Lounge, reviewing the draft statement the communications team had hastily prepared. The executives had given him space to work, understanding that his input would be more candid without their hovering presence. On the sleek tablet they'd provided, he scrolled through the carefully crafted sentences, marking areas that still relied too heavily on corporate euphemisms. The original draft had been predictably vague. Zenith Airlines regrets the misunderstanding that occurred on Flight 1372 and is investigating the matter. We are committed to providing excellent service to all our passengers. Marcus had replaced it with something more direct. Zenith Airlines acknowledges that on Flight 1372 today, crew members engaged in discriminatory behavior toward a black passenger, Air Force Commander Marcus Williams, Reedy Blur. The crew's actions represented racial profiling, which violates our stated values and policies. We have removed the involved employees from service pending investigation and are taking immediate steps to address both this specific incident and the underlying systemic issues it reveals. His phone buzzed with an incoming text from Aliyah. "Dad, you're trending on Twitter. Are you okay?" A moment later, his phone rang. It was his daughter. "Aliyah," he answered. "I'm fine. Everything's under control." "Under control?" she echoed, her voice a mixture of pride and concern. "Dad, there are 3 different videos circulating online. You're being called Commander Dignity on social media. People are sharing their own stories of airline discrimination in response." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temple. This wasn't just about him anymore. Not that it ever had been. "I didn't intend to become a hashtag today." "Too late," Aliyah replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "The internet has claimed you as its newest champion. One of the passengers who left the plane with you posted a 3-minute video with a detailed account of what happened. It's been shared over 50,000 times in the last hour." 50,000? Marcus repeated, genuinely surprised. The scope and speed of the public response was something he hadn't anticipated. And climbing. Zenith Airlines' social media accounts are being flooded. They'd better have a good response ready. "Actually," Marcus said, glancing down at the tablet, "I'm reviewing their statement now. They've asked for my input before they release it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Wait, seriously? They're letting you approve their public statement?" "More or less," Marcus confirmed. "I'm in their executive lounge. I've just finished a meeting with their VP of Customer Experience, Chief Diversity Officer, Legal Counsel, and Director of Flight Operations." "Wow," Aliyah breathed. "That's not the typical corporate response." "No," Marcus agreed, "it's not. They seem genuinely interested in addressing this properly, though I'm still cautious about their long-term commitment." "As you should be," Aliyah said firmly. "Companies like this make promises when they're under public scrutiny, then quietly revert to business as usual once the spotlight moves on." Marcus smiled at his daughter's cynicism, well earned, after watching her father navigate similar situations throughout her childhood. "They've offered me a consulting role to help them improve their policies and training." "Are you considering it?" "Maybe," Marcus replied, surprising himself with the admission. "If they're willing to commit to transparency and measurable outcomes." They've also arranged for me to take their corporate jet to D.C. tonight, so I won't miss tomorrow's testimony. "A private jet?" Aliyah whistled. "They're really pulling out all the stops." "They understand the stakes," Marcus said, his tone growing more serious. "The videos make it impossible to dismiss this as a misunderstanding or isolated incident." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Through the glass panel, Marcus could see Sandra Mitchell waiting patiently. "I should go, sweetheart. I'll call you once I'm in the air." "Okay, Dad. And just so you know, I sent the video links to Uncle James." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Your godfather, James? The one who runs the National Veterans Advocacy Alliance?" "Yeah, that Uncle James. He's already reached out to 3 major news networks. He said, and I quote, 'This is exactly the kind of thing we've been talking about for years.'" Marcus closed his eyes briefly. James Baldwin had been his closest friend since their first deployment together 30 years ago. Now the director of one of the most influential veterans organizations in the country, James had a talent for leveraging media attention to drive policy change. I'm not sure whether to thank you or scold you for that, Marcus said with a wry chuckle. You can thank me later, Aaliyah replied confidently. This is important, Dad. It's bigger than one flight or one airline. I know, Marcus said softly. I love you, Aaliyah. Love you too, Dad. Go change the world. Again. As he ended the call and gestured for Sandra to enter, Marcus reflected on how different this was from the way his own father had handled similar situations. Growing up in the 1980s, he'd watched his dad swallow countless indignities, choosing to protect his family by avoiding confrontation rather than demanding respect. Pick your battles, his father would say. Over the years, Marcus had come to understand that sometimes the battles picked you. Commander, Sandra began as she took a seat across from him. How are we looking with the statement? Marcus handed her the tablet. I've made some significant edits. Your original draft was too vague and passive. It needs to directly acknowledge what happened. Sandra skimmed his revisions, her expression shifting from concern to thoughtful consideration. This is much more direct than our typical communications approach. That's the point, Marcus replied. Typical approaches aren't working. They protect institutions at the expense of real accountability. Sandra nodded slowly. You're right. And in this case, with video evidence already circulating, anything less direct would come across as disingenuous. She looked up, meeting his gaze. I'll send this to the team for immediate release. There's one more element missing, Marcus added. A clear statement about the specific changes Zenith is committing to implement, with timelines and accountability measures. We're still developing those details, Sandra admitted. Then say that, Marcus advised. Acknowledge that you don't have all the answers yet, but specify when you will present a comprehensive plan. Transparency about the process is just as important as transparency about the incident. Sandra made a note on her phone. That's excellent advice. We'll add that section immediately. She paused, studying him with newfound respect. You know, Commander, you have a remarkable talent for this. Your ability to balance accountability with practical next steps is exactly what we need. Years of military command experience, Marcus replied with a small smile. Finding the balance between addressing failures and maintaining forward momentum is essential in any leadership role. Have you given any more thought to our consulting proposal? Sandra asked, trying to keep her tone casual, though Marcus could detect the eagerness beneath. I'm still considering it, he answered honestly. I believe your intentions are sincere, but I would need certain guarantees before committing. Such as public reporting on progress for one, direct access to your CEO and board to ensure the initiative has top-level support, and a commitment to engage with community organizations that have been working on these issues for years. Rather than balking at these conditions, Sandra seemed almost relieved. Those are all reasonable requests. I can work with our team to formalize these terms before you leave for Washington. The door opened again and Rachel Kim entered with a tablet of her own. Commander Williams, the corporate jet is being prepared for departure. We'll be ready to leave in about 45 minutes. Thank you, Marcus acknowledged. I also thought you might want to see this, Rachel added, handing him her tablet. On the screen was a social media feed displaying the hashtag #CommanderDignity, which was now trending nationally. Below it were thousands of comments and shared stories from people recounting their own experiences with discrimination during air travel. It's remarkable how quickly this has resonated with people, Rachel observed. Many are saying your calm, dignified response gave them courage to speak up about their own experiences. Marcus scrolled through some of the comments, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. He hadn't asked for this spotlight, but perhaps it could serve a greater purpose than just addressing one incident on one flight. Our CEO called while you were reviewing the statement, Sandra said, reclaiming his attention. He'd like to speak with you during your flight to D.C. if you're amenable. He's taking this very seriously. I'd be happy to speak with him, Marcus replied, handing the tablet back to Rachel. Excellent. The plane has secure video conferencing capabilities. Sandra checked her watch. We should head to the executive terminal in about 15 minutes. In the meantime, is there anything else you need? Marcus considered for a moment. Actually, yes. I'd like to speak with Dr. Elaine Winters and the other passengers who deplaned with me, if they're still in the terminal. Sandra seemed surprised by the request, but quickly recovered. Of course. I believe most of them are in the main lounge area. I'll have them brought here if you'd prefer privacy. The main lounge is fine, Marcus said, standing. I'd like to thank them personally. As they walked through the exclusive lounge, Marcus noticed how heads turned in his direction. News of what had happened had clearly spread throughout the terminal. Some passengers nodded in recognition or quiet support. Others quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation of privilege that his story represented. In a corner of the main lounge area, Marcus spotted Dr. Winters and 3 others from the flight engaged in animated conversation. They fell silent as he approached, then broke into warm smiles of recognition. Commander Williams, Dr. Winters greeted him, standing to shake his hand. We were just discussing your impressive stand. How did your meeting with the executives go? Surprisingly well, Marcus admitted. They seemed genuinely committed to addressing this properly. A younger man with glasses, whom Marcus recognized as one of the passengers who had deplaned with him, spoke up. They should be. My video has over 100,000 views already. The court of public opinion isn't giving them much choice. Aaron here is something of a social media influencer, Dr. Winters explained with a slight smile. His following ensured this story wouldn't be ignored. Marcus turned to Aaron with newfound appreciation. Then I owe you my thanks. Your quick action has helped elevate this from an individual complaint to a conversation about systemic issues. Aaron shook his head. No thanks necessary. What happened on that plane was wrong, plain and simple. I just made sure people knew about it. The executive terminal at Denver International Airport existed in a parallel universe to the main concourses, a world where lines didn't exist. Security was discreet but thorough, and the seating resembled an upscale hotel lobby rather than the utilitarian benches of public waiting areas. Marcus sat in a leather armchair, reviewing his notes for tomorrow's testimony while waiting for the final preparations on the corporate jet. Sandra Mitchell had excused herself to manage the public relations aspects of the situation, leaving Marcus in the capable hands of Rachel Kim, who was coordinating his travel arrangements with impressive efficiency. Commander Williams? Rachel approached with a tablet in hand. Our statement has been released. It's generating significant engagement already. Marcus set aside his notes and accepted the tablet. The statement on Zenith's official social media accounts and website incorporated nearly all of his edits, acknowledging the racial profiling directly and outlining a commitment to transparency in addressing both the specific incident and the broader systemic issues. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. First time I've ever seen an airline actually admit to racial profiling instead of hiding behind corporate speak. This is what accountability looks like. Now let's see if they follow through. As a Black frequent flyer who's experienced similar treatment, I'm cautiously optimistic about Zenith's response. The real test will be what happens next. There were critics too, of course. PR damage control. They're only doing this because they got caught. Too little, too late. This happens every day to people who don't have viral videos to protect them. Both perspectives contain truth, Marcus reflected. The airline was certainly motivated by the public relations disaster unfolding in real time, but their response had gone beyond typical corporate damage control. The acknowledgement of racial profiling specifically, rather than vague references to not meeting our standards, represented a significant departure from the usual playbook. "The CEO's office has sent over a brief for your call," Rachel said, handing him a slim folder. "Gregory Pearson has been CEO for 3 years. Previously headed operations at Continental before the merger. He's generally considered progressive on diversity issues, but there's been criticism that initiatives haven't translated to meaningful change on the front lines." Marcus accepted the folder with a nod of thanks. "Do you always prepare such thorough briefings for passengers?" Rachel allowed herself a small smile. "Only for those who manage to mobilize our entire executive team on a Saturday afternoon." A suited security officer approached them. "The aircraft is ready, Ms. Kim, Commander Williams, if you'll follow me, please." As they walked across the tarmac toward the sleek Gulfstream G650, Marcus felt a momentary twinge of dissonance. Just hours ago, he'd been unceremoniously removed from a commercial flight. Now he was boarding a private jet arranged specifically for him. The contrast illustrated the absurdity of the situation. It had taken a public relations crisis for his dignity to be respected. The interior of the jet was exactly as one would expect. Cream leather seats, polished wood tables, and an atmosphere of rarefied privilege. A flight attendant greeted him with a deference that bordered on reverence, quite different from the suspicion he'd faced earlier. "Commander Williams, welcome aboard. I'm Claire. We expect a smooth flight to Washington, approximately 3 hours. The CEO will be calling once we reach cruising altitude. Is there anything I can get you before takeoff?" "Just water, thank you," Marcus replied, settling into one of the plush seats. Rachel took the seat across from him, setting up her laptop. "I'll be accompanying you to D.C. to ensure everything goes smoothly," she explained. "Sandra asked me to coordinate with your congressional liaison to make sure tomorrow's testimony isn't impacted by today's events." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's not necessary. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own schedule." "Of course," Rachel said smoothly. "Consider me a resource rather than a handler. Zenith wants to ensure we don't add any further complications to your important work." As the jet taxied toward the runway, Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from James Baldwin, Aaliyah's godfather and the director of the National Veterans Advocacy Alliance. "Just saw the videos. Perfect timing. Call me ASAP. This feeds directly into tomorrow's testimony." Marcus frowned slightly. While he understood James's perspective, the incident provided a powerful real-world example of the disrespect veterans often faced. He was wary of allowing tomorrow's testimony to be overshadowed by today's events. The committee hearing was meant to address critical funding for veterans' health care, not airline discrimination. The jet accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the air. As Denver receded below them, Marcus felt the familiar sensation of compartmentalizing, setting aside the personal to focus on the mission ahead. It was a skill he'd honed through decades of military service, the ability to process and then set aside emotional reactions in favor of strategic thinking. Once they reached cruising altitude, Claire approached with a satellite phone. "Commander, CEO Pearson is ready for your call whenever you are." Marcus nodded, accepting the phone. "Thank you. I'll take it now." Rachel discreetly moved to the rear of the cabin, giving him privacy for the conversation. "Commander Williams," came the voice from the other end, confident but with an undercurrent of concern. "Greg Pearson here. First, let me personally apologize for what you experienced today on our airline." "I appreciate that, Mr. Pearson," Marcus replied evenly. "Please call me Greg. I've reviewed the videos and spoken with Sandra and Terrence at length. There's no excuse for how you were treated." "No, there isn't," Marcus agreed, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "But the more important question is what happens next." There was a brief pause before Pearson continued. That's precisely why I wanted to speak with you directly. Sandra mentioned you had reservations about our consulting proposal. Reservations about its potential effectiveness, yes. Corporate diversity initiatives often function as reputation management rather than vehicles for genuine change. Another pause, longer this time. When Pearson spoke again, his tone had shifted from corporate diplomacy to something more personal. "Commander, may I be candid with you? I'd prefer it. When I took this position 3 years ago, improving our record on diversity and inclusion was one of my top priorities. We've instituted training programs, revised hiring practices, established employee resource groups, and implemented reporting systems for discrimination incidents. Our metrics look good on paper. But what happened to you today makes it painfully clear that we've been checking boxes without changing culture." The admission was surprisingly frank. Marcus found himself reassessing his impression of the CEO. "That's a perceptive assessment," Marcus acknowledged. "Culture change is significantly harder than policy change." "Exactly," Pearson agreed, sounding relieved at Marcus's understanding. "And that's where I believe your perspective would be invaluable, not as a conventional diversity consultant, but as someone who can help us identify where the disconnect is happening between our stated values and the lived experience of our passengers and staff." Marcus considered the proposal carefully before responding. "If I were to consider this role, I would need direct reporting access to you and the board, complete transparency about both successes and failures, and a commitment to measurable outcomes tied to executive compensation." He expected pushback on at least some of these conditions, particularly the last one. Instead, Pearson responded without hesitation. "Those terms are acceptable. I'm prepared to establish a special committee of the board focused specifically on this initiative, with you reporting directly to that committee and to me. We'll develop metrics together, and yes, I'm willing to tie executive bonuses to those outcomes." The readiness of Pearson's agreement suggested he had already been thinking along similar lines. Perhaps the CEO had been seeking leverage to push through more substantive changes against institutional resistance. "One more condition," Marcus added. "I would want to bring in community stakeholders who have been working on these issues long before today's incident. Civil rights organizations, diversity experts, advocacy groups. Real change requires multiple perspectives, not just mine." "Agreed," Pearson said firmly. "In fact, I'd consider that essential to the initiative's credibility and effectiveness." Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by Pearson's approach. The CEO seemed to grasp that this moment represented not just a crisis to be managed, but an opportunity to drive meaningful institutional change. "I'll need time to consider the offer properly," Marcus said. "My focus right now is on tomorrow's congressional testimony." "Of course," Pearson replied. "There's no rush for an immediate decision. What matters is getting this right." He paused before adding, "Speaking of your testimony, is there anything Zenith can do to support your work on veterans issues? Today's incident was inexcusable, but I'd like to find ways we might contribute positively to the causes you're advocating for." The question seemed sincere rather than transactional. Marcus considered it thoughtfully. "Actually, yes. One of the issues I'm testifying about tomorrow is the difficulty veterans face in accessing care due to transportation barriers, particularly those in rural areas who live far from VA facilities. A corporate partnership program that provided travel assistance would make a tangible difference." "Consider it done," Pearson said without hesitation. "I'll have our corporate social responsibility team develop a proposal. We could potentially leverage our roots and partner networks to create a comprehensive travel program for veterans needing medical care. That would be a meaningful contribution," Marcus acknowledged. "I'll have something concrete for you to review within the week," Pearson promised. "And Commander Williams, thank you for your candor today. It would have been easier for you to simply take legal action against us, which would have been entirely justified, rather than engaging in this conversation about systemic change. Legal action might address my situation, Marcus replied, but it wouldn't help the next person who faces discrimination. Systems only change when those within them are willing to acknowledge their flaws and commit to correcting them. Your response today suggests that willingness exists at zenith. After the call ended, Marcus gazed out the window at the landscape passing below, processing the conversation. Pearson had impressed him. The CEO had taken personal responsibility without defensiveness and shown a genuine commitment to substantive change rather than surface-level remedies. His phone buzzed with another message, this time from an unknown number. Commander Williams, this is Brenda Miller from the Denver Post. I'd like to speak with you about today's incident on Zenith Airlines. Your experience highlights ongoing issues of discrimination in air travel. Please call me at your convenience. Marcus stared at the journalist's message, weighing his options. The story was already public, but amplifying it further through media interviews would shift the focus even more dramatically. He needed to consider the implications carefully. Everything all right, Commander? Rachel asked, noticing his pensive expression as she returned to her seat. Just considering how to respond to media inquiries, he replied, setting his phone down. The story seems to be gathering momentum. Rachel nodded. Our communications team reports that the hashtag has reached over 2 million impressions. Several major news outlets have contacted us for comment, and we're directing them to the official statement for now. She hesitated before adding, They're all requesting interviews with you, of course. Marcus wasn't surprised. His decades of military service had taught him that timing and message discipline were crucial in high-visibility situations. I'll hold off on interviews until after tomorrow's testimony, he decided. The veterans' health care funding issue needs to remain my priority. That's admirable, Rachel observed. Many would seize the spotlight. The spotlight has found me without my seeking it, Marcus replied with a slight smile. My responsibility now is to use it thoughtfully. The remainder of the flight passed quickly as Marcus refined his testimony for the congressional hearing. The principles remained the same. The critical need for expanded mental health services, improved accessibility for rural veterans, and streamlined bureaucracy for benefits processing. But now he had a powerful personal example to illustrate the persistent disrespect many veterans faced in civilian life. As the private jet began its descent into Dulles International Airport, Claire approached with a satellite phone. Commander Williams, you have an incoming call from Secretary Martinez at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Marcus accepted the phone with surprise. Elena Martinez had been appointed VA Secretary just 8 months earlier, and though they had met briefly at several functions, he wouldn't have considered them close acquaintances. Commander Williams speaking. Commander, Elena Martinez here. I've just been briefed about the incident in Denver. Are you all right? I'm fine, Madam Secretary, Marcus assured her, though I'm surprised it's reached your attention so quickly. Your testimony tomorrow is critical to our budget discussions, Commander. When videos started circulating showing you being removed from a flight the day before, it naturally raised concerns. There was a pause, and frankly, the content of those videos is disturbing on a personal level as well. I appreciate your concern, Marcus said, but I assure you, I'll be well prepared for tomorrow's hearing. I have no doubt, Secretary Martinez replied. In fact, what happened today may actually strengthen your position. The committee needs to understand that the disrespect veterans face isn't abstract. It's concrete and ongoing, even for someone of your stature. Marcus hadn't expected this perspective from the secretary, but he recognized the strategic insight. That had occurred to me as well, he admitted. I've taken the liberty of alerting Chairman Reynolds about the situation, Martinez continued. He's agreed to give you a few additional minutes tomorrow to address it if you wish to include it in your testimony. Now Marcus was genuinely surprised. Chairman Reynolds, a conservative senator not known for his flexibility on scheduling, rarely adjusted hearing formats. That's unusually accommodating of the chairman. Secretary Martinez's tone carried a hint of satisfaction. Let's just say that even the most partisan members of the committee understand the optics of dismissing the concerns of a decorated black veteran who was just publicly discriminated against. Sometimes the political winds align with justice, Commander. After the call ended, Marcus reflected on the secretary's words. He had never been comfortable using his personal experiences as political leverage, but perhaps in this case, the visibility of the incident could serve a greater purpose. The jet touched down smoothly at Dulles, where another layer of privileged treatment awaited. Instead of taxiing to the main terminal, they pulled directly to the private aviation center, where a black SUV was waiting on the tarmac. We've arranged transportation to your hotel, Rachel explained as they descended the aircraft stairs. Unless you'd prefer to go elsewhere first. The hotel is fine, Marcus replied, though I'd like to meet with James Baldwin this evening if possible. The director of the Veterans Advocacy Alliance, Rachel clarified. I can arrange that, of course. The drive into Washington was swift and efficient, the SUV cutting through traffic with the confidence of a vehicle accustomed to carrying VIPs. Marcus watched the familiar landmarks pass by, the memorials and monuments that commemorated sacrifices made in service to ideals that were still imperfectly realized. His phone had been steadily buzzing with notifications since they landed. News outlets, veterans groups, civil rights organizations, all seeking comments or interviews about the incident. Among them was a message from Dr. Elaine Winters. The airline reached out to all of us who deplaned with you. They're offering compensation and asking for our input on policy changes. Your impact is already visible. Proud to have stood with you today. The message reminded Marcus that what had happened affected more than just him. It had created a moment of collective conscience, a small but significant instance where people chose to stand against injustice rather than remain comfortably silent. The SUV pulled up to the entrance of the Watergate Hotel, where the staff had clearly been alerted to his arrival. The general manager himself greeted Marcus at the entrance. Commander Williams, welcome to the Watergate. We're honored to have you with us. Your suite has been upgraded, and we've arranged for a private dining room should you wish to have meetings this evening. The red carpet treatment continued as Marcus was escorted to a luxurious corner suite with panoramic views of the Potomac. Once alone, he loosened his tie and allowed himself a moment to process the day's extraordinary turn of events. Less than 12 hours ago, he had been deemed suspicious and unworthy of respect. Now he was being treated like visiting royalty. The juxtaposition wasn't lost on him. This was precisely the sort of inconsistency that characterized the black experience in America. Respect that should be fundamentally human became conditional, situational, dependent on status and visibility, rather than inherent dignity. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Opening it, he found James Baldwin standing in the hallway, a broad smile on his face. Shorter than Marcus, but powerfully built. With a closely cropped salt and pepper beard and intense eyes, James had the commanding presence that had served him well, both as a Marine Corps colonel and now as an influential advocate. Marcus Williams, James said, pulling him into a brief, firm embrace. You sure know how to make an entrance in D.C. Marcus chuckled, ushering his old friend inside. Trust me, this wasn't how I planned to begin my trip. Plans change, James replied, taking a seat in the suite's living area. Sometimes for the better. Do you have any idea what this moment has created? My phone hasn't stopped ringing since the first video hit social media. Marcus poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal carafe. and handed one to James. "It's been the same for me, but this attention needs to serve a purpose beyond my individual situation." "Exactly," James agreed enthusiastically. "And the timing couldn't be more perfect for tomorrow's hearing. Chairman Reynolds has already signaled to me that he's prepared to use this incident as leverage for the funding package." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Reynolds? The same senator who last month suggested that veteran benefits were becoming excessive." James's smile turned slightly cynical. "The same. Amazing how an election year and viral videos can shift priorities." He set his glass down. "But we would be fools not to use this momentum. The airline incident perfectly illustrates the core of tomorrow's testimony, that those who've served this country continue to face disrespect and systemic barriers." Marcus nodded slowly. "Secretary Martinez called me with similar thoughts. She indicated Reynolds might give me additional time to address the incident directly." "He will," James confirmed. "I've just come from a meeting with his chief of staff. They're revising the schedule now." He leaned forward, his expression intensifying. "Marcus, this is an opportunity we couldn't have manufactured if we tried. The funding bill has been stuck in committee for months. Now suddenly, Reynolds and 3 other holdouts are signaling support." The implications were clear. Marcus's personal humiliation, captured on video and amplified through social media, had created political capital that could potentially benefit millions of veterans. "I've revised my testimony to reference the incident," Marcus acknowledged, "but I'm wary of making it the centerpiece. The systemic issues we're addressing existed before today and will continue after the news cycle moves on." "Agreed," James said with an approving nod. "Use it as an illustration, not the foundation, but don't underestimate its power as a concrete example of what we've been saying for years, that respect for veterans can't just be ceremonial, it must be substantive and consistent." The conversation shifted to practical preparations for the hearing, anticipated questions, key statistics, and strategic framing of the funding requests. James had always been the more politically savvy of the two, with an intuitive understanding of Washington's power dynamics that complemented Marcus's straightforward, principled approach. After nearly an hour of discussion, James glanced at his watch. "I should go. You need rest before tomorrow." He stood, then paused, his expression growing more serious. "Have you decided how to handle the media interest? Every major outlet is requesting interviews." "I'm focusing on the testimony first," Marcus replied. "After that, I'll consider which platforms might advance the broader conversation most effectively." James nodded approvingly. "Smart approach. Control the narrative rather than letting it control you." He moved toward the door but stopped with his hand on the knob. "You know your father would be proud of how you handled today. He always taught us to stand our ground, even when he couldn't always do it himself." The mention of his father brought a familiar tightness to Marcus's throat. Samuel Williams had worked as a postal carrier for 37 years, raising Marcus and his siblings with a quiet dignity that persisted despite the indignities he often faced. "Pick your battles," he would say, but his eyes held a silent pride whenever Marcus stood up against injustice. "I was thinking about him earlier," Marcus admitted. "How different his options were from mine." "Different times," James agreed. "But the same courage runs in the blood." He opened the door. "Get some sleep, Commander. Tomorrow we make it count." Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus's hotel suite as he stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced precision. The charcoal suit, white shirt, and navy tie projected exactly the image he intended for today's testimony: professional, authoritative, and unimpeachable. On his lapel, he wore 2 pins: the American flag and the Air Force insignia, small symbols that carried immense weight in the corridors of power he would navigate today. His phone buzzed with a text from Aaliyah. "You're all over the morning shows. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox. Zenith stock is down 3% in pre-market trading. Kill it today, Dad. Love you. Marcus smiled at his daughter's characteristic blend of news analysis and personal encouragement. The market impact wasn't surprising. Corporate America often responded more decisively to financial pressure than moral appeals, another reminder that change required multiple forms of leverage. A knock at the door announced the arrival of his transportation to Capitol Hill. Zenith Airlines had arranged for a car service, but Marcus had politely declined, preferring to use the Veterans Advocacy Alliance's regular driver. It was a small but meaningful choice, maintaining his independence rather than becoming indebted to the airline that was now actively courting his favor. James was waiting for him in the lobby, engaged in an intense phone conversation that he quickly concluded as Marcus approached. "Morning, Commander." James greeted him with a firm handshake. "Ready to make history?" "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Marcus cautioned with a small smile. "Today is about securing necessary funding, not making headlines." "Sometimes you can do both," James replied as they walked toward the exit. "Have you seen the news this morning?" "Just headlines," Marcus admitted. "I've been focusing on my testimony." "Well, you should know that all three major networks led with your story. Zenith stock is taking a hit, and their CEO is scheduled for an interview this afternoon to discuss their response plan." Marcus absorbed this information with a slight frown. The spotlight seems to be shifting away from the veterans' healthcare issues. "On the contrary," James countered as they slid into the back seat of the waiting SUV. "Your experience has given a human face to the broader pattern of disrespect veterans encounter. The media is making that connection explicitly." He handed Marcus his tablet, showing a morning show segment titled, "From Service to Disrespect. The Commander Williams Incident Highlights Challenges Veterans Face." The chyron at the bottom read, "Williams to testify before Congress today on veterans' healthcare funding." "They're linking the two narratives," James explained as the car pulled away from the hotel. "Your personal experience has created a gateway for discussing the systemic issues. It's communications gold, Marcus." Marcus handed the tablet back, his expression thoughtful. "As long as the substance doesn't get lost in the spectacle." "That's why your testimony today is so important," James agreed. "It anchors the emotional response to your experience in concrete policy proposals." The ride to Capitol Hill was quick, but the scene that greeted them upon arrival was unexpected. A small group of veterans had gathered on the steps of the Senate office building, many in uniform or wearing service-indicating caps and jackets. They held signs reading, "Respect our veterans," and "Stand with Commander Williams." "Did you organize this?" Marcus asked, surprised. James shook his head. "Organic response. Veterans groups across the country have been mobilizing since last night. This is just the D.C. contingent." As Marcus emerged from the vehicle, a ripple of recognition passed through the gathered veterans. Several approached, offering handshakes and words of support. "Commander Williams, we've got your back," said an older man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap. "What happened to you happens to us all the time," added a younger woman with a prosthetic leg visible below her skirt. "Thank you for not staying quiet." The spontaneous show of solidarity was deeply moving. These weren't just supporters of a viral moment. They were fellow service members who recognized in Marcus's experience echoes of their own. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus said, addressing the group. "Today's testimony isn't just about my experience. It's about ensuring every veteran receives the respect and care they've earned through their service." A chorus of agreement met his words as James gently steered him toward the building entrance. "We need to get inside. The committee staff is waiting." The administrative offices of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee were a hive of activity when they arrived. Staff members moved with the focused urgency of people managing an event that had suddenly grown in significance. The committee clerk, a seasoned professional named Eleanor who had managed these hearings for over a decade, greeted them with evident relief. "Commander Williams, Mr. Baldwin, thank you for being prompt. There's been a change in the schedule. Chairman Reynolds has moved your testimony to the first position this morning." She lowered her voice slightly. "The media presence is significantly larger than usual." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. "Has there been any change to the scope of my testimony?" "The chairman has indicated you should proceed as planned, but has allocated an additional 5 minutes for you to address yesterday's incident if you choose to," Eleanor explained, leading them to a small preparation room. Inside, Secretary Martinez was waiting, her expression brightening as they entered. "Commander James, good morning." She extended her hand to Marcus. "How are you holding up with all this attention?" "Focused on the mission, Madam Secretary," Marcus replied with a slight smile, "though I admit the scale of the response has been surprising." "It shouldn't be," Martinez said firmly. "What happened to you crystallized something many Americans sense but can't always articulate, that there's a gap between our public veneration of veterans and how they're actually treated in daily life." James nodded in agreement. "Exactly why today's testimony is so crucial. We're connecting the dots between respect in rhetoric and respect in policy." A staff member appeared at the door. "10 minutes until the hearing begins. The room is at capacity, and there's an overflow crowd in the hallway." Secretary Martinez straightened her jacket. "I should take my seat. I'll see you both in there." At the door, she paused. "Commander, whatever approach you take today, know that the department stands with you." After she departed, Marcus reviewed his notes one final time while James provided last-minute updates on which committee members were present and their likely lines of questioning. The familiar pre-mission routine helped center him, gather intelligence, assess the environment, clarify objectives. Eleanor returned to escort them to the hearing room. As they approached, the buzz of conversation grew louder, noticeably more energetic than typical committee proceedings. When they entered, Marcus understood why. The room was packed to capacity. In addition to the usual attendees, committee members, staff, department officials, and advocacy representatives, there were rows of media personnel with cameras positioned along the back wall. As Marcus walked to the witness table, he noted several veterans in uniform scattered throughout the audience, their presence a silent statement of solidarity. Chairman Reynolds, a silver-haired senator from Ohio known for his fiscal conservatism, gavelled the session to order. His opening remarks struck a different tone than his usual procedural formality. Today, this committee convenes to address critical funding needs for veterans' healthcare services. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge our first witness, Commander Marcus Williams, whose experience yesterday has reminded us all that the respect we owe our veterans cannot be merely ceremonial but must be substantive and consistent. The chairman's framing aligned perfectly with the narrative James had outlined earlier, a promising start that suggested the political winds were indeed shifting in their favor. "Commander Williams," Reynolds continued, "the committee has allocated additional time for your testimony in light of recent events. You may proceed when ready." Marcus adjusted the microphone and looked directly at the assembled senators. In that moment, he made a strategic decision to depart slightly from his prepared remarks, recognizing the unique opportunity this heightened attention presented. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of the committee. I appear before you today not just as a retired Air Force commander, but as one voice representing millions of veterans whose service to this nation deserves to be honored not just with words, but with actions." He paused, making eye contact with several committee members before continuing. "Yesterday, I experienced something that many veterans, particularly veterans of color, face regularly. The dissonance between our nation's stated reverence for military service and the reality of how veterans are sometimes treated in civilian life. The room was completely silent. Every person present focused intently on his words. Marcus deliberately kept his tone measured, professional, avoiding any hint of victimhood or personal grievance. While my experience on that flight has received considerable attention, I want to be clear. I am not here today to discuss that specific incident. I am here because what happened yesterday is merely symptomatic of a broader reality that directly connects to the funding decisions before this committee. Several senators exchanged glances, perhaps surprised by his refusal to capitalize on the personal drama that had captured public attention. Every day, veterans face barriers to respect and essential services that contradict our national narrative about honoring their sacrifice. They wait months for medical appointments. They navigate Byzantine bureaucracy to access benefits they've earned. They struggle with mental health challenges without adequate support systems. They face homelessness despite having served their country with honor. Marcus gestured to the folder before him. The statistics in my written testimony paint a clear picture. Over 20% of veterans in rural areas live more than an hour from the nearest VA facility. Appointment wait times average 32 days for new patients. 20 veterans die by suicide every day. Behind each of these numbers are real people who wore the uniform of this country. Marcus continued his testimony, his voice steady and authoritative, as he navigated through the statistical evidence and policy recommendations. The room remained transfixed, the usual side conversations and smartphone distractions notably absent as committee members gave him their full attention. The funding package before this committee isn't about creating new entitlements, Marcus emphasized. It's about fulfilling existing promises. When men and women take the oath to serve this country, they do so with the understanding that their nation will not abandon them after their service concludes. Yet our current systems too often fail to provide even basic dignities, timely health care, accessible facilities, responsive mental health services. He turned a page in his notes, pausing briefly before shifting his approach. Yesterday on that flight, I was reminded that respect isn't universal or guaranteed, even for those who've served at the highest levels. But what troubled me most wasn't the personal disrespect. It was knowing that for every veteran with the platform to speak out, there are thousands who suffer these indignities in silence. Several senators nodded, including some who had previously expressed skepticism about expanding VA funding. The crew members who profiled me could see my suit but couldn't see my service, Marcus continued. They could assess my skin color, but not my sacrifice. This tendency to overlook the humanity and dignity of veterans isn't limited to airlines. It permeates our institutions, including at times those designed specifically to serve veterans. He directed his gaze specifically to the committee members who had been the most resistant to funding increases. When veterans wait months for critical care, when they travel hundreds of miles to reach the nearest VA facility, when they navigate endless paperwork to access earned benefits, these are all forms of disrespect just as real as what I experienced yesterday, though less visible to cameras. The strategic connection between his personal experience and the broader policy issues landed precisely as intended. Marcus could see it in the shifted postures of the senators, the scribbled notes being passed among staff members, the approving nod from Secretary Martinez. The funding package before you addresses these systemic failures directly, Marcus concluded. It expands telehealth services for rural veterans, reduces wait times through additional staffing, streamlines benefits processing, and strengthens mental health resources. These aren't luxuries or excesses. They are the minimum fulfillment of promises made to those who served. As Marcus finished his formal testimony, Chairman Reynolds adjusted his glasses, visibly moved despite his usual stoic demeanor. Thank you, Commander Williams. Your testimony today connects principles to policies in a way this committee rarely encounters. He glanced at the other senators. We'll now proceed to questions. Senator Harrison, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Senator Harrison, a veteran herself and longtime advocate for military families, leaned toward her microphone. Commander Williams, thank you for your powerful testimony. I'd like to focus on the rural access provisions in the funding package. Could you elaborate on how the proposed mobile clinic program would function in practice? The question shifted the conversation toward practical implementation details, precisely where Marcus had hoped to direct the committee's attention. For the next 45 minutes, he fielded questions about specific aspects of the funding proposal, drawing on his extensive knowledge of veterans' healthcare systems and the challenges faced by different demographics within the veteran community. Throughout the questioning, Marcus maintained the same calm authority he'd demonstrated during the confrontation on the plane. When Senator Whitfield, a fiscal hawk known for challenging veteran benefit expansions, attempted to characterize the funding package as financially irresponsible, Marcus responded with measured precision. Senator, I understand budget constraints are a reality. However, when we examine the long-term costs of inadequate veteran care, increased homelessness, untreated mental health conditions that lead to substance abuse and suicide, preventable physical health deterioration, we find that proper funding up front is fiscally prudent. These aren't just moral investments. They're economically sound ones. By the time Chairman Reynolds gavelled the session to a close, the shift in the committee's collective posture was palpable. Several senators who had been non-committal about the funding package were now expressing tentative support, while others who had opposed it outright were requesting additional briefings to review the evidence Marcus had presented. As Marcus gathered his materials, Senator Harrison approached the witness table. Commander, exceptional testimony today. I believe you've moved the needle significantly on this package. She lowered her voice. And for what it's worth, the way you handled yesterday's incident has earned you tremendous respect in this building. Thank you, Senator, Marcus replied, though I'd prefer the focus remain on the funding needs rather than my personal experience. Sometimes personal stories are what finally make statistical realities impossible to ignore, she observed before being pulled away by a staff member. James appeared at Marcus's side as they exited the hearing room, his expression one of barely contained triumph. That was masterful, Marcus. Absolutely masterful. You positioned the airline incident as context without letting it overshadow the policy substance. Marcus nodded, accepting the assessment while scanning the crowded hallway. Media representatives were gathered at the exit, cameras and microphones at the ready. Looks like we're not done yet. No choice but to engage, James advised, but keep it brief and focused. Redirect to the funding package whenever possible. As they approached the media gauntlet, a press aide from the committee stepped forward. Commander Williams, we've set up a more orderly press availability in room 232 if you'd prefer. Chairman Reynolds thought you might appreciate a more structured format. The thoughtful accommodation was another indicator of how the dynamics had shifted. Marcus accepted with a grateful nod, and they were escorted to a smaller room where journalists were arranged in rows with a podium at the front. The press conference lasted 20 minutes, with Marcus fielding questions that ranged from details about the funding package to his experience on the plane to his thoughts on Zenith's response. Throughout, he maintained the same disciplined messaging approach, acknowledging his personal experience, but consistently steering the conversation back to the broader issues affecting all veterans. When asked about Zenith's CEO publicly committing to systemic changes, Marcus gave a measured response. I appreciate Mr. Pearson's apparent sincerity and the concrete steps Zenith has announced. Real change requires sustained commitment beyond the immediate crisis, and I'm cautiously optimistic about their approach. However, my focus remains on ensuring veterans receive the health care and support they've earned through their service. As the press conference concluded, Rachel Kim approached from the back of the room. "Commander Williams, I observed your testimony. Truly impressive. Mr. Pearson asked me to extend an invitation to meet with him in person when you return to Denver. He'd like to discuss the Veterans Transportation Program you proposed and finalize details about the consulting arrangement if you're still considering it." Marcus acknowledged the invitation with a polite nod. "Please tell Mr. Pearson I'll be in touch after my return. My schedule here in Washington is quite full." Rachel smiled, understanding. "Of course, the offer stands whenever you're ready." She hesitated before adding, "I also wanted to let you know that all 3 crew members involved in yesterday's incident have been terminated, effective immediately. Mr. Pearson felt you should hear that directly." The news wasn't entirely surprising, but Marcus felt no satisfaction in it. Firing the individuals without addressing the culture that enabled their behavior would accomplish little. "Thank you for the update. I hope Zenith is also investing in systemic changes to prevent similar incidents." "That's precisely what Mr. Pearson wants to discuss with you," Rachel confirmed. "The crew members' actions were inexcusable, but we recognize they were symptoms of deeper institutional issues." After Rachel departed, James checked his watch. "We've got 30 minutes before your meeting with the Senate Veterans Caucus. The word from their office is that several members who weren't previously supporting the funding package are now looking for ways to get on board." Marcus gathered his briefcase, reflecting on how dramatically the landscape had shifted in less than 24 hours. "Politics has always been about narrative," he observed. "Yesterday changed the story in ways we couldn't have engineered." As they walked through the Capitol corridors, Marcus's phone buzzed with a notification. A major veterans organization had just announced a boycott of Zenith Airlines until the company implemented comprehensive anti-discrimination training and revised its passenger interaction protocols. "The pressure continues to build," James noted, reading the same alert on his own phone. "Zenith is facing a perfect storm: stock price dropping, boycott threats, viral social media outrage, and potential congressional scrutiny. Their response so far has been better than most," Marcus acknowledged. "The question is whether it represents genuine commitment or just crisis management. Either way, you're now in a position to influence outcomes far beyond what we anticipated," James pointed out. "Your consulting role could ensure it's the former rather than the latter." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "If I accept that role, it would need to be structured in a way that creates genuine accountability. No confidentiality agreements that prevent me from speaking publicly about their progress or lack thereof." "Absolutely," James agreed. "Your credibility is the leverage. Use it wisely." Their conversation was interrupted by an aide from Senator Harrison's office who approached with an urgent expression. "Commander Williams, Senator Harrison asked me to inform you that Chairman Reynolds has just announced his support for the full funding package. He cited your testimony as clarifying the moral and practical imperatives involved." The news was significant. Reynolds had been the primary obstacle to the package advancing out of committee. His support virtually guaranteed it would move forward to the full Senate. Marcus exchanged a meaningful look with James. Their primary objective for this Washington trip had been achieved, accelerated by circumstances neither could have predicted. "Thank you," Marcus told the aide. "Please convey my appreciation to the senator for her continued leadership on veterans issues." The remainder of Marcus's day unfolded in a whirlwind of meetings, each one reflecting the seismic shift in political dynamics caused by the convergence of his airline experience and congressional testimony. The Senate Veterans Caucus, a bipartisan group that often struggled to find common ground, showed unusual unity in their support for the funding package. Even senators typically resistant to increased federal spending were now positioning themselves as champions for veterans' dignity. "It's remarkable how quickly the rhetoric changes when the cameras are rolling," Senator Diane Lockhart observed during a private moment with Marcus after the caucus meeting. A Navy veteran herself, Lockhart had been fighting for expanded mental health services for years. "I've been making the same arguments about respect translating to concrete support for 3 terms now. Suddenly it's the popular position. The window of opportunity won't stay open indefinitely," Marcus replied. "We need to move this package forward while the momentum exists." "Already happening," Lockhart assured him. "Reynolds is fast-tracking the committee vote for tomorrow morning. With his support, we'll have the votes to advance it to the floor next week." She studied him thoughtfully. "You've accomplished in 24 hours what we've been struggling to achieve for 2 sessions. Sometimes the right messenger at the right moment changes everything." By late afternoon, Marcus had briefed 4 additional congressional offices, conducted a roundtable with major veterans service organizations, and recorded a segment for the PBS NewsHour. Throughout, he maintained the same disciplined messaging, acknowledging his personal experience, but consistently redirecting focus to the systemic issues affecting all veterans. As the day's formal schedule wound down, Marcus found a quiet moment in an empty committee room to call Aaliyah and update her on the day's developments. "Dad, you're everywhere," she told him, her voice brimming with pride. "The hashtag has evolved from Commander Dignity to Respect All Vets. Social media is flooded with veterans sharing their own stories of discrimination and disrespect." "That's far more important than anything that happened to me," Marcus replied. "Individual incidents can be dismissed as anomalies. Patterns can't be ignored so easily." "Speaking of patterns, have you seen Zenith's latest announcement? They're establishing an independent oversight board for their diversity and inclusion initiatives. And guess who they want to chair it?" Marcus sighed. "I haven't formally accepted any role with them yet." "Well, they seem pretty confident. Their stock has actually started to recover since they announced these changes. Wall Street apparently thinks you're good for business." Aaliyah's tone carried a hint of irony. "How are you feeling about all this?" It was a simple question that required a complex answer. Marcus took a moment before responding. "Guardedly optimistic about the policy outcomes, uncomfortable with the personal attention, and determined not to let either the airline incident or the media response distract from the substantive issues." "So, exactly as I expected," Aaliyah replied with a warm chuckle. "Always focused on the mission." After ending the call, Marcus checked his calendar for the evening. He had a dinner scheduled with James and several key allies from veterans organizations to strategize next steps for the funding package. Before heading there, he decided to take a short walk around the Capitol grounds to clear his head. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mall as Marcus strolled along the paths he'd walked countless times during his military career. Washington had always represented a paradox to him, a city that simultaneously celebrated American ideals while often failing to embody them in practice. Today, he'd witnessed both the best and worst of the system: political opportunism alongside genuine commitment, performative respect alongside substantive action. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. Normally, he would let it go to voicemail, but something prompted him to answer. "Commander Williams speaking." "Commander, this is Karen Chen from Zenith Airlines." The voice was hesitant, almost timid, a stark contrast to the corporate representatives he'd dealt with thus far. "Yes, Ms. Chen. How can I help you?" Marcus kept his tone neutral, wondering why a Zenith employee would be contacting him directly rather than through official channels. I wasn't sure if I should call you," she began. "I'm a flight attendant with Zenith. I've been with the company for 12 years, and I wanted to tell you that what happened to you on that flight, it's not isolated. It's systemic." Marcus stopped walking, giving the call his full attention. Go on. There's a culture among certain crews, not all of us, but enough, that encourages profiling passengers, especially in first class. It's never explicit in our training, but it's reinforced through informal channels, crew room conversations, the way supervisors respond to incident reports. I appreciate your candor, Ms. Chen, Marcus said. May I ask why you're telling me this? There was a pause before she answered. Because Zenith is presenting this as a few bad apples, but it's more than that. The company has known about these issues for years. Internal complaints have been filed and ignored. When I heard they were offering you a consulting position, I thought, you should know the full context. Marcus processed this information carefully. Have you shared these concerns through official channels? Multiple times, Karen confirmed, frustration evident in her voice. And the most recent was 6 months ago, after I witnessed a black passenger being questioned about his first-class ticket 3 separate times during boarding. The passenger didn't make a scene, just showed his boarding pass each time. Afterward, I filed a report about the treatment. It was reviewed and dismissed as a misunderstanding. Are there others who would corroborate your account? Dozens, Karen replied without hesitation. Many of us have documented these incidents for years, hoping someone in leadership would eventually take it seriously. But it's always the same response. Individual incidents are dismissed, and the pattern is ignored. Marcus found a bench and sat down, recognizing the significance of this call. Karen Chen was offering insider confirmation of exactly what he had suspected, that the discriminatory behavior he'd experienced wasn't an anomaly, but a manifestation of institutional culture. What would you like me to do with this information, Ms. Chen? If you take that consulting position, don't let them limit the scope to superficial training programs or PR initiatives, she said firmly. Push for access to the internal complaint records. Ask for anonymous surveys of flight crews, especially those from minority backgrounds. There's a wealth of evidence already within the company that could drive meaningful change if someone with your visibility demanded it be addressed. I understand, Marcus said, his mind already calculating how this information might be leveraged. Thank you for taking this risk to reach out. I assure you I'll use this perspective thoughtfully. One more thing, Karen added. There's an informal group of us, flight attendants and ground staff from diverse backgrounds, who've been documenting these issues. If you want more specific evidence or testimonials, we're willing to provide them confidentially. After getting her contact information and assuring her of discretion, Marcus ended the call with a renewed sense of purpose. Karen Chen's insider account confirmed what his instincts had told him. Zenith's problem wasn't just a few biased employees, but a culture that enabled and sometimes tacitly encouraged discriminatory behavior. This information would significantly influence his approach to any consulting arrangement. If Zenith was serious about systemic change, they would need to confront uncomfortable truths about their institutional culture rather than merely implementing surface-level diversity training or disciplining individual employees. Marcus arrived at the restaurant for his dinner meeting with a clearer perspective on both the challenges and opportunities ahead. The private dining room was already occupied by James and representatives from 5 major veterans organizations, including the American Legion, Disabled American Veterans, and the newer, more politically active Post-9/11 Veterans Coalition. Commander Williams greeted Robert Menendez, the American Legion's legislative director, rising to shake his hand. Congratulations on today's testimony. You've created momentum we haven't seen in years. Similar sentiments echoed around the table as Marcus took his seat. The group spent the first hour discussing practical next steps for advancing the funding package, which senators might need additional persuasion, what amendments might be proposed, how to maintain public attention on the issue beyond the current news cycle. As the main course was served, James steered the conversation in a new direction. We should discuss how to leverage Marcus's current visibility for maximum impact. The airline situation has created a platform that extends beyond veterans' healthcare. Marcus recognized the strategic thinking behind James's suggestion. His longtime friend understood that media attention was ephemeral. They needed to capitalize on it while it lasted. "I've been thinking about this as well," Marcus acknowledged, "particularly in light of a conversation I had shortly before arriving here tonight." He shared Karen Chen's insights about the systemic nature of the discrimination at Zenith, carefully omitting any identifying details that might compromise her position. "This confirms what we've suspected," said Tamika Johnson, executive director of the Post-9/11 Veterans Coalition. "The patterns of disrespect toward veterans of color aren't isolated incidents but manifestations of broader institutional biases, which suggests an opportunity to address multiple issues simultaneously," James added. "The veterans funding package is moving forward. That's our primary win. But we could also use this moment to establish new standards for how corporations interact with veterans, particularly veterans from marginalized communities." The veterans' leaders gathered around the table quickly recognized the strategic opportunity before them. What had begun as Marcus's personal experience of discrimination had evolved into a potential catalyst for addressing multiple interconnected issues. "If you accept Zenith's consulting offer," Tamika suggested, "you could establish a framework that becomes an industry standard, not just for airlines but for corporate America more broadly." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's precisely what I've been considering. But with this new information from inside Zenith, I'm even more convinced that any consulting arrangement would need to include unrestricted access to internal data and the authority to speak publicly about what I find." "They'll resist that," Robert cautioned. "Corporations hate transparency about their internal issues." "Which is exactly why it's necessary," Marcus replied. "Surface-level diversity initiatives fail precisely because they don't address the underlying cultural problems. If Zenith is genuinely committed to change, they'll accept these conditions. If not, their offer is merely a PR strategy." James leaned forward, his expression intense. "This is bigger than one airline or one incident, Marcus. You have leverage to establish a new paradigm for how corporations address discrimination, one that demands evidence-based assessment, measurable outcomes, and public accountability." As the dinner progressed, the discussion evolved into a concrete strategy for leveraging Marcus's visibility to advance both the veterans' healthcare funding and a broader agenda of institutional accountability. By the time dessert arrived, they had outlined a multifaceted approach that would maintain pressure on Congress while establishing clear conditions for Marcus's potential consulting role with Zenith. The next morning, Marcus woke to news that Chairman Reynolds had indeed scheduled the committee vote on the funding package for that afternoon, an unusually swift timeline that reflected the political momentum generated by Marcus's testimony. His phone contained multiple messages, including one from Secretary Martinez, confirming that the Department of Veterans Affairs would provide full implementation support if the package passed. Another message came from Sandra Mitchell at Zenith Airlines. "CEO Pearson would like to speak with you today if possible. We've drafted a formal consulting proposal that incorporates many of your suggested conditions." Marcus forwarded the message to his longtime attorney, Michael Fitzgerald, with instructions to review any proposal carefully before he considered it. Experience had taught him that corporate commitments often contained loopholes and limitations hidden beneath supportive language. As he prepared for another day of meetings, Marcus received a call from Chairman Reynolds himself, an unusual direct contact that signaled the changed dynamics. "Commander Williams," Reynolds began, his tone uncharacteristically warm, "I wanted to personally inform you that the funding package will pass out of committee today. The vote count is secure." "That's excellent news, Mr. Chairman," Marcus replied. "The expanded healthcare access will make a meaningful difference for millions of veterans." Indeed, Reynolds agreed, and I want you to know that your testimony yesterday was illuminating. Sometimes we become so focused on budget numbers that we lose sight of the human impact of our decisions. The admission was surprising, coming from Reynolds, who had built his political brand around fiscal restraint. "I appreciate your willingness to reconsider your position," Marcus said. "Well," Reynolds continued with a hint of political pragmatism, "it also helps that we've identified alternative funding sources that make the package more fiscally sustainable. But your testimony put a face to the statistics in a way that couldn't be ignored." After concluding the call, Marcus headed to the Capitol for a series of follow-up meetings with committee staff to ensure the funding package's specific provisions remained intact during the final drafting process. Throughout the morning, he received regular updates on the growing public support for the initiative, including endorsements from several high-profile celebrities and business leaders who had been moved by the videos of his airline experience. By early afternoon, Marcus was seated in the committee room gallery watching as senators cast their votes on the Veterans Health Care funding package. The final tally was 15-2 in favor, a margin that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. As Chairman Reynolds announced the result, several veterans in the gallery stood in silent recognition of the moment, including Marcus. Outside the committee room, reporters gathered for reactions. Marcus kept his comments focused on the specific improvements the funding would bring to veterans' lives: reduced wait times, expanded rural access, enhanced mental health services, streamlined benefits processing. When questions inevitably turned to the airline incident, he acknowledged it briefly before pivoting back to the substantive policy achievements. "Yesterday's experience on that flight was unfortunate," he told the assembled press. "But what matters today is that Congress has taken a significant step toward fulfilling our nation's promises to those who have served. Real respect isn't shown through ceremonial gestures or public statements. It's demonstrated through concrete actions that address veterans' actual needs." Following the press availability, Marcus's phone rang with a call from Michael Fitzgerald, his attorney. "I've reviewed Zenith's consulting proposal," Fitzgerald reported. "It's surprisingly comprehensive, but still has some concerning limitations. They're offering unprecedented access to internal data and significant authority to shape their reforms, but they've included confidentiality provisions that would restrict your ability to speak publicly about specific findings." "That's a non-starter," Marcus replied immediately. "Public accountability is essential to ensure sustained commitment beyond the current crisis." "I suspected you'd say that," Fitzgerald said with a chuckle. "I've already drafted a counter-proposal that maintains transparency while protecting legitimate proprietary information. I'll send it over for your review before submitting it to their legal team." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus received another call, this one from Gregory Pearson, Zenith's CEO, requesting a direct conversation outside the formal negotiation process. Marcus agreed, and minutes later, they were connected. "Commander Williams," Pearson began, "I understand your attorney is working with our legal team on revisions to the consulting proposal, but I wanted to speak with you directly about the confidentiality provisions." "I appreciate that, Mr. Pearson," Marcus replied. "Transparency is non-negotiable for me. Without the ability to speak publicly about both progress and challenges, there's no true accountability." There was a pause before Pearson responded. "I've just come from a difficult conversation with our board. Some members are concerned that unlimited public disclosure could create liability issues. Others worry about competitive disadvantage if we're transparent about problems that our competitors keep hidden." "Those are understandable concerns," Marcus acknowledged, "but they reflect the same defensive thinking that allows discriminatory cultures to persist. The first company to embrace genuine transparency will set the standard that others will be forced to follow." "That's exactly what I told the board," Pearson said, surprising Marcus with his alignment. "I believe Zenith has an opportunity to lead here, not just manage a crisis. I convinced them to accept modified confidentiality provisions that would allow you to speak publicly about general findings and recommendations while protecting specific employee information and proprietary operational details. The compromise was reasonable, protecting individuals and legitimate business concerns while maintaining public accountability for the overall change process. That approach could work, Marcus agreed. I'll discuss it with my attorney. Thank you, Pearson said, his relief evident. And there's one more thing. Based on the information you shared about veterans' transportation needs during yesterday's call, we've developed a preliminary program proposal. Zenith would provide free transportation for veterans traveling to VA medical appointments, with priority for those in rural areas. We'd like to announce it next week with your involvement if you're willing. The initiative aligned perfectly with the needs Marcus had highlighted in his testimony. That's a meaningful commitment, he acknowledged. I'd be happy to advise on implementing it effectively. After ending the call, Marcus took a moment to reflect on how dramatically circumstances had shifted in just 48 hours. The discrimination he'd faced on that flight had created a cascade of consequences, advancing the veterans' health care funding, forcing Zenith to confront its institutional culture, and now potentially establishing a transportation program that would benefit thousands of veterans. The final meeting on Marcus's Washington schedule was with James and Secretary Martinez to discuss implementation planning for the funding package, assuming it passed the full Senate as now seemed likely. As they worked through the details, Marcus shared updates on the developing situation with Zenith. They're moving quickly, Secretary Martinez observed. Corporate America responds to financial pressure more readily than moral appeals. True, Marcus agreed, but what matters is ensuring the changes are substantive and sustained beyond the current crisis. Which is why your consulting role is so critical, James added. You have the leverage right now to establish conditions that will maintain accountability over time. As the meeting concluded, Secretary Martinez shook Marcus's hand with genuine appreciation. What you've accomplished this week extends far beyond the funding package, Commander. You've demonstrated how individual dignity, when firmly maintained, can drive systemic change. Later that evening, Marcus packed his briefcase in preparation for his return to Denver the following morning. His phone buzzed with a message from Aaliyah containing a link to a just-published interview with Brenda, one of the flight attendants involved in the original incident. Rather than the defensive posture he might have expected, Brenda's comments revealed unexpected reflection. I've spent the past 2 days watching the videos and examining my actions. I see now how my assumptions influenced my behavior. While I've lost my job, which is appropriate, I hope this incident creates change beyond just removing a few employees. The problems are deeper than individual actions. The acknowledgement was significant, recognition that the incident reflected systemic issues rather than just personal failings. Marcus found himself respecting her willingness to publicly own her mistakes rather than retreating into defensiveness. As he finished packing, Marcus received a final call for the day from Karen Chen, the Zenith flight attendant who had provided inside information about the airline's culture. I've heard rumors that you're negotiating a consulting role with provisions for transparency and accountability, she said without preamble. Is it true? We're working through the details, Marcus confirmed. I've insisted on access to internal complaint data and the ability to speak publicly about findings. That's unexpected, Karen admitted, her voice reflecting cautious optimism. Most of us assumed the company would pursue the usual playbook, public apologies, followed by confidential settlements and internal training that changes nothing. This situation created unusual leverage, Marcus explained. But sustained change will require continued pressure from both outside and inside the organization. Our internal group is ready to provide whatever information would help, Karen assured him. For the first time in years, there's actual hope that things might change. After ending the call, Marcus stood at the hotel window overlooking the Washington Monument, illuminated against the night sky. The structure had always represented for him both the aspirations of American democracy and its unfinished work. Much like his own military service, had been simultaneously a defense of American ideals and a recognition of how far the nation remained from fully embodying them. His phone buzzed one final time with a message from James. Committee vote officially recorded. Package moves to full Senate next week with strong bipartisan support. This is happening, Marcus. Real change for real veterans. Marcus smiled, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction. The primary mission had been accomplished. Concrete progress on veterans' health care funding that would translate to improved lives for millions who had served. The airline incident, painful as it had been, had created leverage for advancing that mission and addressing broader patterns of discrimination. Tomorrow he would return to Denver, where negotiations with Zenith would continue and media attention would eventually fade. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in the specific policies and practices under discussion, but in the balance of power between those who experienced discrimination and the institutions that enabled it. Standing up for dignity wasn't just a personal choice. It was a strategic act that could catalyze systemic change when leveraged effectively. That was the lesson Marcus would carry forward, and the example he hoped would inspire others to transform their own moments of disrespect into opportunities for meaningful progress.